The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's BATIC Institute webinar on performance incentives for public-private partnerships. My name is Susan Howard, and I'm the director of the BATIC Institute at AASHTO. Before getting started, I'd like to review a few logistical matters. You should have received an email with a link to the PowerPoint presentations for today. If you did not receive it, please visit the BATIC Institute website at financingtransportation.org. A copy of the PowerPoint is available there for download. Everyone will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. At any time, you may submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel for the live question and answer session that we'll have after the presentations are complete. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the BATIC Institute website by the end of the day tomorrow. For those of you who aren't familiar with the BATIC Institute, we provide capacity building support to state DOTs and their partners around project finance techniques for transportation. We provide in-person services such as training events, and we also do these through an online platforms like this webinar. We also work on research around transportation finance techniques. For more information on our services and how we may assist your organization, feel free to contact me at showard@ashto.org and check out the resources on our website, financingtransportation.org. Thank you for attending today's webinar, and a big thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Just a reminder that the slides will be available as well as a recording of the webinar on the BATIC Institute website in the coming days. We'll also post the responses to the questions that we have during the Q&A period. So a little bit about today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing incentives that stimulate developer performance in a public-private partnership, also known as a P3. Our speakers will describe how these incentives may be used in different phases of the project lifecycle. This webinar outlines the costs, benefits, and risks associated with alternate contracting methods and accelerated performance specifications. We'll hear about Maryland's Purple Line project and the Eagle P3 project in Denver, and those projects' experiences using performance incentives. We hope participants today will gain a better understanding of the array of performance incentives that state DOTs may use throughout the P3 lifecycle. Today's speakers are Keith Molinar, a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and Dean of the Engineering School. Ivar Draganja, who is the commercial lead for the Purple Line project owned by the Maryland Transit Administration. Joe Christie, the Denver Eagle project director, and Jennifer Ross Amato, Deputy General Counsel of RTD in Denver. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Molinar to get us started.
Thanks, Susan. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome to everyone here. Today I'm going to talk to you about a Federal Highway Administration study that I was part of with the team here at the University of Colorado, the University of Kansas, and Hill International. I'm going to set the framework for our next speakers and really talk to you about the context of costs, benefits, and risks associated with alternative contracting methods and accelerated performance specifications. I won't be specifically speaking about P3 projects, but you'll see that these are related and really set the framework for P3 projects and incentives. The central question to our research project was, how do delivery methods relate to project performance? This was one of the most thorough studies I've been involved in my 20+ years of looking at project delivery research. We had more than 15 investigators from these different agencies and collected data on 291 completed projects, detailed data on projects that were finished so we could see how the performance related to the different variables that we were studying. And those variables really dealt with the delivery method, the way things were procured, incentives, and other elements. I'll only be able to highlight what we're talking about here today. So if you see the link at the bottom of the screen on your right, you'll be able to click on that and download the PDF of the report and look at it at your leisure. I really want to spend just a few minutes on the data collection so you can see how comprehensive this is. This is a slide of all states with design build experience, and also our federal lands and highways were part of this, Western, Central, and Eastern federal lands. We took a rigorous two-step approach to collecting our data. we started by getting projects from contract databases. So the real cost, schedule, change order, other data that was available from the contract databases with the agencies. From there, we followed up with appropriate questions to project managers and got detailed responses for more qualitative or additional detail than just those hard cost and schedule facts. I just want to show you a little bit of our sample so you can get a feel. Design build and construction manager general contractor are still relatively new, and there's a number of states that don't use the delivery methods, but we sampled from those states who use it the most. You can see Florida had the most projects in terms of design build because they've been doing design build since the late 1980s, early 1990s, and have the most projects. CMGC is really a delivery method that's occurred within the last 10 years here. So you see these are the states with CMGC experience, not as many as design build. And this shows you the sample of the data that we collected around CMGC projects. You can see that Utah has the most experience in the United States, and that's why they had the most projects represented in our sample. We really needed to compare CMGC and design build to a baseline. So therefore, we looked at similar projects in design bid build from throughout the US. You can see here that Florida contributed the most design bid build contracts because we needed that for a comparable sample with design build and CMGC. So putting this all together, we ended up with 291 projects with a really good sample of design bid build, construction management, general contractor, and design build. You'll see we ended up shifting these into two types of design build because they were really different, we found out in the end. One is a design build low bid. These were projects that were used with a lump sum low bid versus design build best value, which was a best value procurement, and these were the larger projects. We were actually a bit surprised by the number of low bid projects, but they ended up being small, rapid response projects that states used this delivery method for. You can see in our chart that we have a good representation of design bid build versus our other alternative delivery method. So I hope that gives you some confidence in our data set. I wanted to show you just a couple of the findings, and again, we encourage you to go look at the full report. The first one I want to show you is a comparison of the timing of award for design bid build and design build low bid. These were our small projects. We looked at a representative sample between $2 and $10 million. What we found on the bottom, you can see that design build low bid projects were completed, agency design, contractor design, and construction before our design bid build projects were even out the door, were even finished designing. So not only do you get a large savings in time, what we found is the agencies also got early certainty of cost. They knew what their project was going to cost much, much faster using design build low bid. Again, these were surprising findings to us. They're somewhat similar to what we see in building and water wastewater projects, but we actually saw larger savings with highway projects. So our other sample that I wanted to compare and show you was design bid build, construction manager, general contractor, and design build best value. Again, this is where we're selecting by cost and other technical factors. Here our most closely related projects were between $10 million and $50 million. Again, a few surprises here. One, it's been known that design build is faster than design bid build for a number of years across the highway sector. But again, we were surprised to see that design build best value was finishing almost before a traditional design bid build design would be done. Again, you can see the cost certainty when an owner has a lump sum project cost is much faster with the design build best value. And then finally, we really did not expect this, but what we found was CMGC was finished even faster than our design build best value projects. You can see here that through multiple work packages and awarding the contract to the CMGC earlier, we actually can finish a project much quicker than it takes to develop the best value design build procurement documents. So again, this was very eye-opening for us and really hadn't been seen before, these types of data. I would just show you that the bottom CMGC, you can have multiple packages. such as an earthwork package, a pavement package, other packages. What we're showing here is just two representative ones, but that cost certainty isn't known until the last work package is added. So those previous slides talked about overall time and procurement. I wanted to take just a few minutes and talk about change orders or cost growth, because I know that's a large part of incentives. So this table shows the results of overall change orders. And sorry, it's a little busy, so let me highlight a few things for you. If we look across the bottom, we see that our alternative delivery methods did have better cost growth performance. CMGC had the lowest cost growth, followed by design build best value. The low bid design build was getting close to our design bid build. One thing though that we discovered was some of the change orders with design build were actually happening because owners were adding additional work. I don't have time to show you here, but it's in the reading. The design build projects were actually bidding under the cost of the engineer's estimate, and owners were reinvesting in making agency directed change orders. Another area of cost growth is planned quantity changes. You can see there we got very good results from both CMGC and design bid best value. Unforeseen conditions can happen on any project. I can't directly attribute the alternative delivery method processes to keeping those down, but it certainly is trending towards having collaborative teams being better able to design around and deal with unforeseen conditions. We do see a higher rate of unforeseen condition change orders on design bid build projects. I know I covered a lot in a short time, and you can read more in the report, but I did want to wrap up by just talking about how do delivery methods relate to incentives. What I would propose to you is that owners create the environment for project success, and to truly take advantage of incentives and some of the performance advantages that we've seen, owners really should be looking at creating a collaborative environment through the use of design build and construction manager, general contractor type delivery methods. Why do I say that? These collaborative delivery methods truly do support the environment for success. We can take that example of lower unforeseen conditions. I don't believe that's just by luck. Again, it's difficult, even with a sample of 291 projects, to statistically show that. But it does show that teams working together across all three methods have better success. And finally, I would say that design build and construction manager, general contractor project methods will enable effective use of incentives. Why is that? To truly meet schedule goals, to keep change orders down, you have to have engineers working with contractors in real time to be able to effectively address changes and contingencies as they arise. So thank you for the time. I look forward to answering any questions. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Ivar to talk about the Maryland Purple Line project.
Thank you, Keith. Hello, everyone. I'm Ivar Dragani. I'm a consultant to M.MTA and the commercial director on the Purple Line for the past 2 years. Prior to that, I was on Skanska's P3 bid team, so you'll get to hear perspectives from both the developer and the owner sides today. Let's take a look at the project from a financial incentive perspective. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get straight to it. First, we're going to talk very briefly about the project overview, so you get a sense of what we're dealing with. And then we're going to look into the developer's view on performance incentives. We're moving on to incentives used on the Purple Line project. Then we're briefly going to touch on how liquidated damages are assessed. Given what you've heard in the press, I'm sure you're very interested in how the owner has worked to ensure that the project has stayed on schedule, so we're going to spend some time on that. And lastly, we should have a little bit of time for a conclusion as well. So the Purple Line, from an overview perspective, it's a 16-mile east-west light railway line between DC and the I-495 Beltway. It connects with a number of other traffic modes, including metro rail stations, commuter rail lines, Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, and regional and local buses. It's a $5.6 billion project spanning over 36 years, which $2 billion is the design build work. There's a bunch of stakeholders that are involved in this. You can see them here. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but you'll see how many they are and how much that they have added to the complexity. For instance, we have no less than 17 utility companies alone, and then we have a whole host of property owners that we've been dealing with as well. So the developer's view on performance incentives. So we have to first take a step back and look at what is the purpose of performance incentives to begin with. If it is to foster time efficiency during constructions, these days the bids are so competitive that there is little float in the schedule to begin with. But if there is a bonus to complete the entire work earlier, the developer would look at how much can be accelerated for the bonus money that would be offered. A balanced risk profile similar to a design-build project could be a better approach. If the risk profile is too unbalanced, like we have seen in some P3 agreements, then additional float is being built into the schedule due to that risk, and also additional cost is being built into the developer's proposal to mitigate for the risk as well. If, on the other hand, the purpose is to focus concessionaire on one or several issues that are particularly important to the owner, then incentives can be useful if the incentive is significant enough as measured against design and construction amount, and also what the owner is trying to achieve. It does put initial effort on the developer's side to achieving the milestone, but if the concessionaire later sees that it cannot meet the milestone, the focus can be lost. To some extent, it helps to have liquidated damages on top of the bonus, so that if you're late, you get hit with liquidated damages instead. That could help mitigate the risk from the owner's perspective. Now, when it comes to bid considerations from the developer's perspective, liquidated damages are actually easier to price in than bonuses. LDs are generally put into the overall risk register for the bid and are evaluated in that way. Bonuses, however, are generally not priced into the bid. The exception is if the bid is extremely competitive, then bonuses will be priced in as well. As for the developer's view, how the developer's view impacts the owner's selection of incentives into the contract, generally, LDs are more prevalent than bonuses in the contracts that I've seen, which makes sense as they're also easier to price in, as we've discussed before. However, the risk profile of the P3 agreement, in my opinion, needs improvement. The general view on the developer side is that there's too much risk that is being put on the developer, and we have indeed seen a number of players exit the P3 market, such as Skanska, Floor, and ACOM, for these reasons. So what incentives have been used on the Purple Line project? Well, the main issue is obviously to drive a timely completion of construction. And so there is a carrot in the P3 agreement that says that if there is an early completion, the revenue service can start earlier. The stick, on the other hand, is if the project is more than a year late, then that would be grounds for concessionaire default. So there's definitely a disincentive to be too late for the project as well. On the operations and maintenance part of the project, there is a fairly complicated non-compliance point system, but in essence, it equates to deductions from availability payments that are being paid on a monthly basis to the concessionaire. And there's also some miscellaneous incentives that are tied to maintenance of traffic flow and some bonus incentives during the design build period related to limitation of odors, dust, noise, vibration, and cleaning. Interestingly, there is a bonus for access and mobility if there's an A rating, but if there's a D and F rating on the same issue, access and mobility, there will actually be LDs. So you have that, the carrot and the stick on that one. As for risk-sharing mechanisms, the real property required for utility easements is considered an additional property, and so the concessionaire is to pay half of that costs for any additional property. There's also cost sharing for utility-related relief events, where you could see incremental costs. The concessionaire takes the first 2.75 million, and the next 2.75 million is shared equally, and the owner takes any additional costs above $5.5 million. Delay costs, on the other hand, are the owner's sole risk. For differing site conditions, which is another hot topic, in general, this is concessionaire's risk, but to the extent that it would be a relief event that is allowable, the concessionaire eats the first 7.5 million, the next is shared 50-50, and any costs above $15 million would be the owner's. Now we come to the interesting stuff. What happened during the construction phase? Well, we could almost ask what didn't happen during the construction phase. Straight off the bat, the record of decision was vacated, which caused some initial trouble to the project. And once that was on track again, we have had issues with right-of-way and acquisition of property interests. We have had issues with third-party and governmental approvals. And now, most recently, as I'm sure you've heard, the design-build consortium has terminated towards the concessionaire for extended delay on the project. So we really had our hands full with various issues throughout the entire construction phase so far. As for assessment of liquidated damages, I'm going to touch on this one very briefly. We have, for traffic flow, there is some LDs that are coming out, vary depending on road type. If they are, the bigger the road, you could say, and the more chaos that's generated, the more money the concessionaire has to pay. So if it's a highway, that's worse than if it's an arterial or another road. The number of lanes closed, the time frame, measured in minutes. The LDs are fairly high, in some instances up to hundreds of dollars per minute. For access and mobility, the DNF ratings, there is an additional day rate that needs to be paid, and then for any additional day rate, the amount bumps up quite significantly. It's 2 to 5 times the initial day rate, depending on the situation. So far, this strategy has been very successful. We haven't really had any traffic flow issues that I'm aware of. The limited access and mobility issues have been very limited, and those have been very quickly resolved. So what has the owner done to ensure that the project has been on schedule? Well, the original RSA date was on March 11, 2022, and the owner has granted officially 160 days of delay, so that will bring us to August of 2022. Now, if you read the Washington Post, you'd see that the concessionaire has requested no less than 976 days on top of the March 11th date, so that will bring us several years later. The owner has undertaken a battery of measures to try to ensure that the project stays on schedule, including weekly meetings, very frequent ad hoc meetings. There's a large site team that monitors things, letters expressing concern for any particular issues. There's been discussions between executive leadership on the MTA side and also the concessionaire board members. MTA has also been quite successful in liaising with other authorities and third parties to help concessionaire with approvals. There are concessionaires' risks, but we're all in the same boat in that we want to make the project a success and complete as close to timely as possible. MTA has also gone as far as suggesting certain technical solutions to resolve some particularly difficult issues. We have been careful not to direct any solutions because that would put MTA at the contractual risk, but some suggestions have been made and the concessionaire has in some cases accepted and implemented those. Lastly, this brings us to conclusion. I cannot emphasize enough that it's really about the public-private partnership, and that's what partnership is in bold print. The P3 agreement can only do so much. It's really vital to have the right partner. And so the procurement scoring criteria should really try to account for past performance on other projects, and local design and build knowledge cannot be underestimated. Also, a balanced risk profile is very important as well, and it will help with the construction performance in terms of scheduling, and as we've seen before, it will also help with the overall costs in terms of the risk profile. Lastly, and the incentives are vital, and they need to be strongly aligned, but they also need to be limited to what matters the most for the project so that there are not too many of them dotted into the schedule, because that could hamper the overall progress and the timeliness of completion for the entire project. I hope that you found this presentation helpful. I wish you the very best with your own projects, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions after this webinar or if you need help with any other issues. And now on to the next speakers, who will be Joe and Jennifer, and they will be talking about the Denver Eagle. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Joe Crispy, and I'll be speaking about the RTD Eagle P3 project scope and background, how the P3 is set up for construction payments and service availability payments, including some incentives, and go over the project challenges we faced. Then Jennifer Rossamato will speak about the dispute resolution process and lessons learned. The project scope includes 3 new electric commuter rail lines from Denver Union Station to Denver International Airport, otherwise known as the University of Colorado A line. Also from Union Station to South Westminster Station, which is the B line, and the West line to Ward Road through Arvada and Wheat Ridge, which is called the G line or the Gold line. It also includes 13 new stations and the associated park and ride facilities. The commuter rail maintenance facility is where the entire rolling stock fleet of 33 married pairs or 66 vehicles are housed and maintained. The University of Colorado A line was first to open on schedule in April of 2016. That was followed by the opening of the B line in July of 2016. Due to regulatory issues associated with the grade crossings, the opening of the G line was delayed until April of 2019. This slide shows the map of the Eagle P3 commuter rail system. Denver Union Station is shown at the center of the map where the star is, and the University of Colorado A line is to the right in gold. The B line to Westminster Station is to the north, shown in blue, and the gold line is shown following the same tracks as the B line to the Pecos Station, where it diverges to the west, also in gold. The commuter rail maintenance facility is located just north of Denver Union Station along the B and G line tracks. A fourth commuter rail line for the North Metro area, or the N line, is being designed and built separately from the Eagle P3 project. This line will terminate at Denver Union Station like the others, and will use the same technologies and rolling stock, but it will be operated and maintained by the brand new RTD Commuter Rail Division instead of the P3 project concessionaire, Denver Transit Partners. Due to time constraints today, I'm going to just quickly touch on the basic principles of the Eagle P3 project approach and refer you to the previous BATIC webinar for more in-depth information on these items. RTD opted to use a performance-based specifications and standard to develop the P3 project. Since this was completely new technology to RTD, being commuter rail versus light rail, RTD wanted to focus on the desired performance of the system and allow the concessionaire the flexibility to select the technology best suited to meet those goals. Similarly, RTD used a performance-based financing approach for this P3 project. This maximized the amount of federal funds available for the project, including a $1.03 billion full funding grant agreement from the FTA and approximately $280 million TIFIA loan. RTD also contributed local sales tax funds, and the contractor made up the difference with private financing. Construction payments were based on earned value progress payments during the design build phase of the project, and service payments were based on the overall availability ratio with incentives and deductions based on performance of service and levels of maintenance. RTD maintains control of the farebox revenues to match the levels of other modes or services across the district. The concession agreement defines how federal and local funds were allocated to pay for the project and defines limits for the use of these on an annual basis. The previous BATIC webinar is about an hour long and goes into much greater detail on these topics. It can be found at the URL listed on this slide. Construction payments were based on the pricing form used to bid the project in a predefined work breakdown structure, organized by alignment and structured to support stakeholder requirements, namely the FTA. Post-award, the pricing form was further detailed to a cost-loaded baseline. Progress was claimed monthly by period earned value and percent complete and validated by RTD staff. The payment cycle flowed well and payments were made within 30 days. The contract established a maximum payment per year that RTD's funding and revenue supported. Once the max curve was paid out, the contractor's financing kicked in. Contractor's funds were set out in a reserve escrow account. The same earned value process was followed, and once approved, funds were released back to the contractor. DTP was motivated to move the job to completion once they were into paying themselves back with set-aside funds. Some work elements were paid via separate invoice outside of the schedule, such as jurisdictional sales tax reimbursement and environmental allowances. For example, identified environmental conditions, actual costs were paid for accordingly, and any remaining funds in that budget line item were split between the concessionaire and RTD at the end of the project. Both entities recouped over $2 million in this line item alone. Service payments are based on an overall availability ratio, which is a formula that accounts for providing the specified levels of service, including compliant car miles, on-time performance, station availability, and the quality of maintenance and cleanliness of public facilities. Service payments are processed on a 30-day payment cycle, and during the revenue period, DTP was motivated to maximize the availability calculation to maximize the payment amount. They earned a bonus each month the availability ratio exceeded a contract-defined performance metric. They can earn up to a 0.5% bonus for an OAR greater than 95% and can be penalized up to 25% for an OAR less than 95%. They also have annual bonuses associated with power consumption. By staying below the agreed target, they get a defined bonus. Like every mega mass transit project, the Eagle P3 was not without its challenges. Some construction issues resulted in nonconformances that required redesign, rework, or other acceptance criteria. The biggest design build issue dealt with ARIMA structural design requirements. During construction, nonconformances identified structural elements that did not meet ARIMA standards. As these multiplied, RTD required that the concessionaire perform an independent design check on all ARIMA structural elements. This IDC resulted in a combination of redesign and rework of some of the elements, and some structures were completely removed and rebuilt. Some of the elements were retrofitted with steel column casings and/or carbon fiber wrap that resulted in an equivalent design by engineering judgment. These issues, along with others, impacted construction schedules and ultimately reduced the time for testing and commissioning activities. The testing and commissioning process began in areas that were complete and ready for testing, then followed that availability throughout the completion of the corridors. In some cases, testing had to proceed when construction was not actually complete. In the case of the grade crossings, this led to complicated traffic control plans for vehicles, pedestrians, and bicyclists. This also increased the number of exceptions and retests that had to be performed to finish testing. Due to excessively long and non-constant warning times at the grade crossings, the Colorado Public Utilities Commission and the FRA would not approve the grade crossings as functioning as designed. This resulted in multiple waivers from the FRA and required additional testing and optimizations to gain approvals by the regulators. The A-line opened up under a waiver regime from the FRA, and that required off-revenue hours testing and the use of roadway flaggers at all grade crossings for an extended period of time. This project utilized an independent engineer to verify that all contract compliance was achieved. The goal was for the IE to validate that requirements for revenue service and final completion milestones had been met and issued certificates for each corridor at those stages. Due to the regulatory issues mentioned above, the IE was not able to issue the revenue service commencement certificates for either the A or the B lines before they opened to the public. Jennifer will speak further on this issue and how it played out in the dispute resolution process next. Third-party projects by stakeholders or developers adjacent to the project impacted construction and operations schedules. For example, the City and County of Denver exercised its option to fund a future station in the Denver International Airport corridor prior to revenue service on the A-line. This required accelerating station construction prior to testing and modifications to the service portion of the concession agreement with the concessionaire. And now, even the inline project by RTD is treated as a third-party project to this contract and has increased the level of effort to process changes and integrate the two systems together. All agreements with third parties require additional cooperation and coordination with the concessionaire. Now here's Jennifer to talk about the dispute resolution process.
The dispute resolution process really began with the side agreements for the A and the B lines that Joe mentioned. While not specifically provided for in the concession agreement, these agreements allowed the concessionaire to begin revenue service without receiving the certifications necessary from the independent engineer. They deducted certain amounts from the service payments once the concessionaire had not received the certifications and approvals by the contract deadlines. And they also made clear that the concessionaire was still responsible for certain contract requirements that should have happened before revenue service began, and as well as resulting costs such as the flagging cost, which was the primary additional cost incurred for the concessionaire's failure to obtain regulatory approvals. The next step of the dispute resolution process was the concessionaire's change in law claims. And there really was only one primary dispute at the end of the project in which the concessionaire alleged this change in law. The focus of this dispute was basically one question: does the at-grade crossing warning system operate as designed? And the idea of a change in law is basically a risk transfer. The concessionaire accepts only those risks that it can manage. And under the concession agreement, the concessionaire has to establish that there was a change that affected the project and that it was not foreseeable at the time of contracting. And in this case, there had been no explicit changes in the laws. The concessionaire's claim is rather that the change is a change in the regulator's interpretation of an existing regulation. And in contrast, RTD's position is that the concessionaire did not deliver the system that it promised. The concessionaire had promised to deliver a system to provide constant warning time, and according to the regulators, this system did not provide constant warning time. The next step is a dispute resolution panel. And under the concession agreement, dispute resolution begins with informal business discussions and ends with a non-binding arbitration process. Thereafter, the parties can choose to pursue a binding arbitration for smaller disputes and go to court for larger disputes. We began dispute resolution of the change in law claims even before the regulatory issues were resolved. But not much was accomplished because it was difficult to resolve the issues from a business perspective without knowing the extent of the risk the parties were incurring. We still had to participate in good faith, and there was a premise of the contract is still about maintaining this long-term relationship between the parties. The dispute resolution panel in this case was 3 experienced construction arbitrators who reviewed limited evidence, which in this case was testimony and documents over a 2-day period, to make a high-level decision on allocation of responsibility. But that decision was non-binding on the parties. RTD also issued a notice of a concessionaire termination event once the concessionaire missed the deadline to complete the design build portion of the project and had not received the appropriate certifications from the independent engineer. And this action put pressure on the concessionaire, not just from RTD, but from bondholders, which caused the concessionaire to put pressure on regulators and the independent engineer. And finally, the change in law claim is now in Colorado State Court, and RTD has asserted certain counterclaims against the concessionaire, and the matter is set for trial in September. So we have 3 lessons learned that we wanted to discuss. The first one is just basically follow the contract. The language in the contract is never going to be perfect or cover every scenario, but it is the framework between which each party entered into this arrangement. And it's the rule of law between the owner and the concessionaire. And at different times, each party will be tempted to negotiate a resolution that departs from those contract terms to achieve an outcome that is expedient in the short term. But those type of agreements can fundamentally alter the parties' relationship, especially the allocation of risk, and are tricky. So it's important to take the time to carefully consider all the consequences of such a change. The next lesson learned is to make sure that everyone understands their roles and responsibilities. And these projects are long-term. People representing both the owner and the concessionaire come and go. And it's important that both sides provide clear leadership, reminding those involved what their roles are. And in a P3, there's a different mindset, a paradigm shift. Our job, we learned as the owner, was to educate our executives and elected officials and the public on the trade-offs of a P3. And in the case of the Eagle project, for example, RTD was the railroad of record for the FRA, but it was the job of the concessionaire to deliver the project according to its proposal, which included obtaining regulatory approvals. But there's still a role for the owner to play, and the owner has to be adamant that the concessionaire meets those requirements of the project. The owner's job is to be a good steward of taxpayer money and ensure the project is delivered as promised. And lastly, it's still about the people. At the same time that we have to take actions grounded in the contract, the success of a project still depends upon the relationships of the individuals who represent the parties. And even in sophisticated projects like the Eagle Project, outcomes can sometimes still depend upon personalities and the trust between the people who represent the parties. It's like a marriage. Both sides are thinking about preserving the long-term partnership. And the representatives need to have experienced team members who understand that P3 paradigm. All right, thank you. And now I'm going to turn it back to Susan.
Thanks so much to all of our presenters. We now have some time for Q&A. So please type questions into the question box, and we'll try to get to some of them. Got a couple to start off with for Keith. First, a point of clarification. We were asked for the definition of CM/CG.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Susan. So construction manager, general contractor is a delivery method. It's been approved by the Federal Highway Administration and implemented by a number of states. It's a two-phase contract. The first contract with the builder is the CM phase, which the construction management phase, they provide things like constructability reviews, cost estimating, and other pre-construction services. They're hired separately from the engineer, who may be the Department of Transportation, or it may be a consultant. Those two partners work together under separate contracts until they arrive at a price for the work packages. So it's pre-construction services, but then arriving at a price for work packages with one contractor. So that's the big difference between design build or design bid build, is that you're working to an agreed upon price. The simple, again, somewhat complex, but the simple aspect of that allows the competition is that the agency doesn't have to execute the construction contract. They could always just use those pre-construction services and turn around and bid it out if they're not happy with the price. That rarely happens. There's only been a few instances where this happened on projects to date, but that's the definition and the high-level overview of how construction manager, general contractor works.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Another question for you. We got a comment. Thanks for the presentation on FHWA's study of alternative contracting method performance. Has anyone had success with a similar study of procurement and delivery methods for transportation mega projects, meaning over that 500 million to 1 billion threshold?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from a academic, scientific point of view, the best we do on those are case studies. It's really very, very difficult to get similar projects or a large data set. The reason we were able to finish the FHWA study that I shared with you was because design build was enabled in the early 2000s, and construction management general contractor allowed in the late 2000 or early 2010s. So we really needed 20 years of data to be able to look at that. There's more case study work done out of the Federal Highway Administration, and the University of Maryland with the Federal Highway Administration has just put together a major projects database where people are entering their data, and hopefully in the next few years we'll be able to get beyond just case study data and be able to get to some of these larger metrics. But the mega projects are unique, take multiple years to finish, and we still need to collect more data as a community to be able to find those types of results. So probably not the exact answer you were looking for, but we are moving in that direction, and I think FHWA is doing a good job with this major projects database that they're building.
Great, thank you so much. We'll move on now to question for Joe and Jennifer. How was energy consumption measured for the Eagle payment incentive? Was additional partnering with the utility provider required?
Jennifer, I'll take this one. So it's a formula-based structure bonus. The power consumption was modeled, early in the design process, and certain levels were set, for typical operation scenarios. As changes were made, like I mentioned, we added a station out at DIA for the city and county of Denver. We had to recalibrate our model and re-estimate those base annual power consumption levels using another station, and we actually had to add another vehicle set to that line to facilitate that and keep the headways like they were. So RTD pays the power bills to Xcel Energy, which is our local energy provider. So we built that incentive in to incentivize the contractor to, minimize power usage overall. So I don't know the actual specifics of the power consumption, how it's measured. That's more of an electrical engineering type question. But that's generally how this incentive was set up, to protect RTD from incurring excessive power usage charges accordingly. So that's how we keep our contractor honest about that.
Great, thank you so much. We'll move on now to a couple questions for Ivar, maybe. Does the Purple Line contract have a dispute resolution process spelled out in its contract like the Eagle P3 does? If so, has that already been exhausted?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, we do. There's more than one track. One is that there is a dispute resolution board that is a voluntary process that the parties can use. And another track is that it goes kind of internally within various steps of M.MTA, and then it comes all the way up to the M.Dot secretary. And once the M.Dot secretary has made his call on the issue, then it is possible for the concessionaire to appeal that decision and then go through the Maryland court system. And as for has this entire process been exhausted, it depends on the issue. We have a couple of issues that have been going on, and there are now a few matters that have been recently decided by or at least there has been a hearing by the secretary, and there might be a decision coming out fairly soon. And depending on the outcome of that, then it would then go to the public court system, or maybe not, right? But that's kind of where we are. There's nothing, to my knowledge, right now that is in the Maryland court system at the moment.
Thank you. Here's one that I'll leave it to you all to maybe to say who might be best to answer. Maybe Keith or others. But the question is, can you expand a little bit more on the process of the engineer certification in a P3 project? How common is it in P3 projects?
This is Keith. I'm going to have to pass on that one if there's someone else who could better answer that.
Okay. Is there anybody else who can answer that one?
Well, this is Joe Christie. I'm not familiar with any other P3 projects, so I don't know whether it's typical or not to use the independent engineer tool. But in this particular project, it was agreed in the concession agreement that RTD and DTP would both hire this independent engineering firm, or joint venture, to collectively review all of the contract compliance verification matrix item. So the contract compliance verification matrix was a part of the concession agreement. The independent engineer, the IE, verified and validated over 15,000 items in that CCVM matrix. They also evaluated, the different regulators' stances on the, the revenue service readiness, and formed a position, based on their independent evaluation, that whether the concessionaire was actually ready to enter revenue service or not. So in this particular case, the regulatory issues were such that they could not justify that, having flaggers at all grade crossings 24 hours a day, 7 days a week met industry standards, even though there was not a specific contract compliance line item for that. So I think the independent engineer is there to protect both the concessionaire and the owner. So in this particular case, it worked out very well for RTD. And I think, in a similar situation, I think on a mega project like that, it would be a best practice to include an independent engineer in your project plan to, help verify that the contract was met, but also, completely independently verify all contractual items were done, without having to use any type of a dispute resolution process. Jennifer, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think every contract is going to have a certain process to reach conclusion. You have to know when you're done, and this is how the Eagle Project's concession agreement works.
Thank you both.
And this is Ivo Dragani. Just to give one more data point on the purple line, we do have an engineer, independent engineer as well, if that's helpful.
Yes, thanks to you all for that response. Ivar, a question for you. You mentioned in your presentation that the risk profile of the P3 agreement needs improvement. Can you expand a little bit on that comment?
Well, what I meant was that if it's too tough a risk profile on the developer as measured against P3 against a normal design build project, to some extent of the bid phase, the developers would price in at a premium the risk that they're not comfortable with. So you're going to end up with a higher price initially, but then if still the contractor would lose money on the project for this reason or another, the developer inevitably is going to try to seek compensation in some way or another. And the issue that you have now is that if it's a couple of years down the line, the state might actually be worse in a worse negotiation position because the project is already underway and you're kind of already hitched your wagon to one contractor as opposed to being in a competitive bidding process with a couple of contractors and then pick what you believe is best. So my 2 cents is that a risk profile that's a bit closer to the design build would benefit the owner as well as the developer.
Thank you. Going back to the Eagle Project and Joe and Jennifer, you touched a little bit on this in terms of some of the sort of technologies that were employed with this project that were new or innovative. So the question is, how should the risks of new technology be considered in the P3 model? In Eagle, how did the P3 model help or hinder development of new technology and innovation?
Jennifer, you want me to take this?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, well, I think we believe the performance-based requirements in this P3 model allowed our concessionaire to utilize new technology to meet the needs of the project. In this particular case, it was a wireless crossing activation system to provide constant warning time at the grade crossings in order to achieve a quiet zone status, which was a requirement of the FTA ROD. So these guys used a brand new PTC system to achieve that goal. Now, the risks associated with that technology are borne by the concessionaire. RTD did not direct them to use that specific technology. So RTD was mostly protected from incurring direct costs associated with these risks. The P3 structure allocated that risk to the contractor for this particular technology on the system. While the contract still provides certain dispute resolution provisions, that gives the concessionaire the opportunity to shift those risks back to RTD, but only if the concessionaire proves that the risks it took on were unanticipated. In addition, there were incentives to ensure that the parties continued to work as partners in the best interest of completing the project and continuing this long-term relationship. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. That's great. Thank you. Appreciate that. We got one other question for Professor Molinar. Back to what we were talking about with alternative contract methods. So the question was sort of putting in context, how is ACM in general related to P3s? The terms I think are used a lot in the same context, but can you expand a little bit upon the difference there, or how they're related?
Sure. So alternative contracting methods is a term used by Federal Highway Administration, commonly called project delivery methods, just in general as well. I think what you'll find is that P3 projects are almost exclusively design build. They're usually not CMGC within the partner. They frequently do something called progressive design build, which is a blend of a design build and a CMGC method, in that most P3s are going to work towards a design build entity and a progressive pricing, so a progressive design build. You see that in water, wastewater, and buildings, even public buildings, all the time. So the way that I see that they're related is the design and construction entity within the larger P3 group is almost exclusively design build, and most frequently a progressive design build, versus what we looked at, which is a best value lump sum or a low bid. So they're related in that way, but extended to be more integrated and more progressive.
Great, thank you so much. We're reaching the top of the hour, and I think we've kind of got to the end of the questions that we have come in. So I think at this point we'll wrap up and thank our speakers very much. We'll first thank our participants very much for attending today's webinar, and a big thank you to our panelists for the great information and great presentations. As a reminder, the slides from this webinar and a recording will be available on the BATIC Institute website by the end of tomorrow. We'll also post responses to the questions. Again, we thank you very much for participating, and ask you to stay tuned to announcements for our next webinars in this series. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.